So first off, I mean, it's an honor to be able to sit here with you and ask you questions. I think that a lot of people in this room, probably owe their existence of their jobs to what you've done in the past. I also, speaking as somebody who's a lot funnier in text form, thank you. I think that this being LA, I figured we should open with the question I think everyone is wondering right now, which is, who are you wearing? Who are you wearing?
What am I wearing? Well, I hope it should be obvious. I don't know, how many layers deep do you want to... There is a story behind this, though, if you haven't heard it. I was at Stanford University doing the internet design work, and I was asked by ARPA back in 1976 to come to Washington to go run the program for them. And my wife, who was from Wichita, Kansas, said, Washington, D.C., three-piece suits. And so she went off to Saks Fifth Avenue at the Stanford Shopping Center and bought three-piece suits, one of which was a seersucker outfit because she knew that during the summertime it was horrible, hot and muggy in Washington. So anyway, I show up at DARPA in my three-piece suit. And a few weeks later, I'm asked to testify before some committee. And I don't even remember which one now, but I wore my seersucker three-piece suit and did my testimony, came back, nothing interesting happens, and then I get a request to show up in the director's office, the director of ARPA, not just the Information Processing Techniques office. So I show up thinking, oh my God, I did something wrong, it's the end of my government career. And he's got a letter in front of him, and he says, I have a letter here from the chairman, and he says, thank you very much for Dr. Cerf's testimony. By the way, he's the best-dressed guy we've ever seen from ARPA. And I took that as positive feedback. So I've been wearing three-piece suits ever since.
Well, I for one, had a very similar interaction with my wife when I left home this morning, where she said, "No, you can't wear a hoodie." So at least we can fit in. So I mean, let's start. We're in LA. I understand you have a personal relationship with LA. I'd love to hear more about that.
I'm sorry.
A personal relationship with LA.
Yes, I do. In fact, although I started out, you can do the math, I started out at Yale Hospital in 1943 in New Haven, Connecticut. But after World War II, my parents moved to Los Angeles. So I grew up here in the San Fernando Valley. I moved around from North Hollywood to Van Nuys and attended Van Nuys High School. And what's very interesting about that school is that there were some other people who turned out to be important to the history of internet who also went to that same school at nearly the same time. So Steve Crocker, who was and still is my best friend, was in the class just behind mine. He and I started the math club, and we both got to get access to computers at UCLA when we were still high school seniors. John Postel, who's another name I hope most of you recognize, also went to Van Nuys High. He was in the class after Steve's. There were some other interesting, and then we didn't know John very well. Steve and I were very close. We all went off to college, and then we reassembled miraculously at UCLA in Len Kleinrock's network measurement lab. And that's where, of course, a lot of the ARPANET development took place. At least the host protocol space of it, and eventually those same people became part of the internet story. It turns out there are some other notable people who went to that same high school before we did. I think people like Robert Redford and Marilyn Monroe and Don Drysdale, and you can look it up if you go look at Van Nuys High. I had dinner with David Skorton a few months ago. He's now the secretary of the Smithsonian, and we got to talking, and he said he grew up in LA, and he said, well, where did you live? He said, Sherman Oaks. And I said, what high school did you go to? He says, Van Nuys High. So about 6 years after I left. But so there must have been something interesting going on in that neighborhood back in the late 50s and early 60s. So I have very strong positive feelings about Los Angeles. And like many of you, I scratch my head a little bit about the technical enterprise here. I mean, we all know about Hollywood. The same head scratching goes on further south in San Diego, which is where I'm headed after I finish my work here at Google in LA. So I think we need to do something to make, I'm probably jumping into other questions that you have, but I think we need to do something to make the LA technical scene more visible to people. There's a lot of capacity here. Last June, at the end of June, I went down to San Diego and spent 2.5 days there. We called it Surfs Up in San Diego. And I know, bad pun. -2. But the idea was to have meetings with little round tables of 20 people coming from different interested disciplines. So a lot of it was biotech, some of it was quantum computing, some of it was advanced high-speed processing, networking, and so there were about 10 or 12 different topics that we picked on and then populated the roundtables. My purpose was to find out what was going on down there. And then at the end of those 2 days, I made a public lecture at the Qualcomm auditorium summarizing what I had learned. And one thing that really surprised me is that there are 850 biotech companies in San Diego, most of them startups, but some of them very big like Scripps. I haven't done that in Los Angeles in a long time. I was out here many years back and we did something called Surfs Up in Hollywood. But I haven't returned to do that, and your line of questions make me think that would be a timely thing to do. The important part being to report what was discovered in some way that's visible to the venture community. Some of you will know that Bill Maris, who used to run our Google Ventures, has now started a Southern California fund specifically to focus on Southern California R&D activities. And so I think that we should take advantage of that. We could certainly use your platform as a way of making things more visible.
Well, I mean, I'm glad to say that we do have an LA office now, so it's very exciting. I'm wondering, is there any particular area in tech that you see being particularly suited to the LA area?
So this is a really good question because the answer is I don't know for sure, which means that like many others, I'm not sure what's going on in Los Angeles or in the San Fernando Valley and LA proper, or out here, in Mountain View, Santa Monica. Historically, there have been some very important things going on here, like RAND, for example. But that was important specifically to the Air Force. There's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which I spend time at on the interplanetary internet. So I know a little bits and pieces, but not much. In fact, one of the most visible technical activities going on now in, I won't say Southern California, because Santa Barbara isn't exactly Southern California, but that's a place where there's some deep work going on in quantum computing at UC Santa Barbara and at Google in that location. So I'm so glad that you're asking these questions, because I'm feeling this void of knowledge that I suspect is actually full of some pretty interesting stuff. I mean, we wouldn't have such a big office here if there weren't a lot of interesting things going on with a lot of very smart people wanting to do something. But I actually don't have a good answer to that question. I will argue that given the fact that Hollywood is here, that there is a lot of technology that's bubbling up well past the old computer graphics stuff that may turn out to be very relevant. One of them is Magic Leap, except that's going on out in Florida. But there are places here, including aerospace, that could potentially make use of some of these new technologies. But I haven't had a chance to sit down and actually probe what's going on. So that's a really useful idea.
You mentioned quantum computing, and speaking as a recovering physicist, it feels like we've been talking about quantum computing for a very long time and not making much headway. Do you think we'll see something approaching quantum computing in our lifetime?
I think there's no doubt about it. Let me offer maybe 2 or 3 observations. The first one is that an early computer that took advantage of quantum effects, I'm wording this very carefully, is the D-Wave system in Canada. There were huge arguments among the physicists about, well, this wasn't really quantum computing, it was adiabatic, and it was a relaxation method, and so on. We acquired one of these together with NASA Ames and began exploring algorithms that we could use on that system. And we found several algorithms that offered optimization of things that we cared about, that were useful to us. In the meantime, however, Hartmut Neven, whose company we acquired and turned into Picasa here in Santa Monica, got very interested in quantum computing and was the reason we bought the D-Wave machine. Hartmut is now the point guy on our quantum effort, quantum development effort. This is serious quantum computing. We've had a 7-qubit system in operation. We are shooting for a 49-qubit system. There's an unfortunate term called quantum supremacy, which sounds, like we want to dominate the world or something. It really speaks to the number of qubits that you need in order to carry out computations that would be either too time-consuming or maybe even nearly impossible using conventional methods. I think they were shooting to get that actually in operation by the end of the year, and now I suspect they hope to get it sometime this year. So this is an important effort because there are certain kinds of computations that lend themselves to this kind of rapid computing, one of which everybody here might know is called Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm is a way of factoring very, very large products of primes, or factoring numbers to determine whether they are prime or not. It turns out that a lot of the security systems, including public key algorithms like RSA, are in fact based on the difficulty of factoring products of large primes. So if Shor's algorithm could be run in a real quantum machine, then you could in fact break some of the cryptography. By good fortune, there are other branches of mathematics that can be adapted to cryptographic purposes, one of which is lattice mathematics. And so there's already a parallel effort to do post-quantum security and cryptography using an alternative. Nonetheless, there are other much more valuable algorithms that may be feasible with quantum systems with enough qubits in them. So I'm now persuaded that we will see serious and useful quantum calculations being done, certainly before the end of this decade. I was up at Bell Labs just last week and had a look at another quantum system that they've been working on. And I'm not an expert in this space, so I'm not sure I will be able to capture very well what they were doing. But suffice it to say that quantum calculation depends on maintaining the entangled state of the qubits. And if you can maintain that entangled state for long enough, then you can actually do a computation and get some answers back. But typically, the duration of quantum state manipulation is on the order of milliseconds, tens of milliseconds, things like that. And this particular thing that the guys at Bell Labs are doing could have more like seconds to minutes of persistence of quantum state, in which case they would have the ability to do much more serious computations. So I think there is real, I have real expectations that we will be applying quantum methods within a few years' time. At Google, some of you will know that we've invested in a variety of different computational platforms, CPUs, GPUs, now TPUs for the tensor processing units for machine learning, and I fully expect that QPUs will be there at some point as well.
I mean, another one of those, harbingers of doom in our industry is always talking about AI and the progression of AI. And that also seems like, up until recently, that was something that was in the distant future. How do you see the development of AI in recent years?
Well, I was around in the 1960s, which sounds like it was sometime near the Civil War, even though that's 100 years later. It was at Stanford. Back when the computers were actually a series of tubes.
So
at Stanford, there was a great deal of excitement. John McCarthy and Ed Feigenbaum and others were founders of artificial intelligence. They were thinking mostly of general artificial intelligence, where a computer program would learn to reason about a world model that it formed from its interactions with the real world. But I remember an early attempt at machine language translation. We naively, I didn't participate in this, so that I'm just giving you the observer's perspective, but they naively just loaded a Russian-English dictionary into the computer in the hope that it would just do natural translation. So then they fed in an English language expression, out of sight, out of mind. And they translated it into Russian through this dictionary. Then they translated it back, and it came back, invisible idiot. And that's when they realized there was probably more to this translation thing than just a dictionary. Well, a series of evolutions occurred in this natural language translation, one of which was statistical methods, where you have a large corpus of documents that are the same documents in multiple languages. And you use a simple, relatively simple statistical way of saying this phrase in this language is frequently associated with that phrase in this language. And you use these statistics in order to do the translation. This got us a fairly significant improvement in the quality of translation, and then we sort of flattened out. Subsequent to that, the development of large, large numbers of layers of multi-layer networks. We're talking about hundreds of layers, for example, allowed us to do even better translations. What surprised me about this particular kind of machine learning is that instead of having a different neural network for each language pair, which is what I imagined would be necessary. So if we do 100 languages, that's 10,000 different pairs in both, each direction. We ended up building one gigantic neural network and feeding it all language pairs. And I thought, well, this is hopeless, how could that possibly work? But with enough layers in a neural network, my little cartoon model, my understanding of this is fairly superficial, but my little cartoon model says that the more layers you have in the neural network, the more state information you can remember. And so as you feed these systems more and more examples and you train them, yes, you got it right, or no, you got it wrong, this experience is encoded in the various weights that show up in different places in the layers of the neural network. So we discovered that by allowing multiple languages to be trained on this single neural network, that we get improvement in all language pairs. Something interesting is going on there. On the other hand, there are also places where mistakes happen. And so here we are in 2018, we still don't have perfection. I was in Heidelberg last year, and I was looking up the weather report to see, what was the weather going to be for that day. And so since I was in Heidelberg doing my little Google search, it directed me to what was a German website. I didn't actually notice that because it was translated so quickly that I was seeing English. And so I thought it was an English language website. And I was looking at the report. It said, it was 0 chance of rain and 0 chance of fog. And there was also 0 chance of ice cream. And, I looked at that, and so I took this to my German friends and said, you have ice cream storms here? Well, it turns out that the word ice, E-I-S, in German could be interpreted either as ice cream or as hail. And the natural language processing system didn't have enough context, apparently, to figure out which one it was, so it said ice cream. So, of course, I took a screenshot of that, and I sent it to our natural language processing guys to remind them that we had not achieved perfection yet. But I can say with some assurance that our machine learning methods are becoming incredibly powerful. Just to remind you, a year or so ago, the DeepMind team built the AlphaGo system and taught it how to play Go at grandmaster level. We had contests in South Korea and in China. The machine won almost all of the contests with these grandmasters, I think, except for one, which at least it all managed to get 1 out of 5 successfully. But that in itself was not the most dramatic example for me of what is happening with that technology. The most dramatic example is called AlphaZero. And in this case, instead of spending weeks training the programs and letting them play each other, different versions of the program playing each other, millions of games, over a period of 3 days, starting only with the rules of Go, they got AlphaZero to learn how to play Grandmaster level Go, which is astonishing. To make matters even more astonishing, starting with the rules of chess, AlphaZero learned in a few hours to play better than any of the known computer-based chess playing systems. Now, this is not to say that that particular 3-hour learning system would produce, could beat an international grandmaster, a human player. But the fact in a few hours that they could train it to play chess that well was really quite astonishing. So that tells you that there is great power in machine learning and many, many different applications. We still don't entirely understand all the things that are going on in the machine learning space. So in these neural networks, for example, if you train it to distinguish the classical cat from a dog, it's then possible to alter a small number of pixels in the challenge picture and have the system, this small number of pixels is not distinguishable to a human being. It still looks like a dog to us. But the machine learning system could say it's a kangaroo. And so there is something going on with the weight of the pixel, each pixel in the image, as it's being processed working through this neural network. There's little places somewhere in the chain that are particularly sensitive to those pixels. And if you change those pixels, it causes the system to make the wrong decision. This is a little bit like chaos theory, and I'm not trying to draw more than just a superficial analogy here. But in chaos theory, you know that a chaotic system will produce very widely varying outputs based on very, very small changes in the input. And so it's not continuous. And so we're seeing a similar kind of thing going on. Now, that's machine learning. Some of it's spectacularly good, like being able to detect a problem, a diabetic retinopathy, for example. We trained a neural network to look at images of people's retinas, and then we had ophthalmologists, something 85 of them, assess whether or not this image demonstrated or did not demonstrate the diabetic retinopathy syndrome. Then we trained a neural network on the basis of that data, and the neural network did a better job than the ophthalmologists did on new subsequent examples. So we clearly have a very powerful technology. None of this is what I would call general purpose artificial intelligence. The thing that you and I do that machines don't right now is to take from a small number of samples the ability to model what we are experiencing and then to reason about that model. And so, as an example here, this thing is a table. What is the main property of table? Well, it's a sort of a flat surface. And the thing that we quickly understand is that there are many things that could be a table, could be an orange crate, could be anything with a flat surface. And the other thing we've understood implicitly is that if something has a flat bottom, then it can be placed on a table and the table will support it. If it's not a flat bottom, it may fall over or roll off the table. So we very quickly get this idea, very quickly, but machines don't. Because at the moment, they don't formulate models that you can reason about. And I think that's the next big breakthrough, is understanding how to present information to a system that can reason about it. Now, if you look at a self-driving car, I'm sorry, I'm really answering, I hope you don't mind. I mean, this is what happens.
It's a big question.
Former Stanford professors can rattle on for 50 minutes on any topic, even if they know nothing about it. So I promise I won't do 50 minutes on this. But the self-driving cars, of course, have been in the headlines, partly as a consequence of that very sad accident that happened to an Uber self-driving car. What's interesting about the Waymo effort at Google, or at Alphabet, is the amount of image recognition and inference that these systems exercise. And so there's a classification effort. The field of view is gathering data visually with LiDAR, and of course detailed knowledge of where am I and what are the streets that I should be on and so on. These systems classify images in the field and then make predictions about what those classified objects might do. So this is somebody on a bicycle, this is a pedestrian, this is a truck, this is a car. The modeling that goes on is very important because the system is predicting possible future outcomes of what those objects might do. And it's planning what to do if any of those particular things eventuate. And that is a form of model building. And so I think we are edging into some interesting territory. Now, that is not done exclusively by machine learning neural networks. It's also done by very deliberate programming. Again, my knowledge of this is relatively superficial, so I can't quite tease apart for you which parts are deliberate programming and which parts are inferred learning from machine learning. But the mix is quite powerful. Finally, everyone who sees some of these results, whether it's a self-driving car or impressive game-playing, board-playing skills, or medical image analysis, everyone should appreciate that these are extremely narrow behaviors. These are very powerful but very narrow behaviors. And human beings exhibit an incredibly broad range of abilities to abstract from the real world that they sense, build models, and reason about them. And so we're a long ways away, I think, from having that capability in place.
So I have to thank you again for the name, because I think if we do have a Reddit Skunkworks AI project, we'll have to call it Invisible Idiot. You know, we talk a lot in tech about the future. I'm wondering if there's any technologies that you've seen in your career that never really caught on, and what those were, that should have, maybe.
Well, there are several that have, of course, clearly the machine learning TPU stuff is pretty dramatic. Recently, I was just at the Open Networking Summit this morning in downtown LA. And I have been looking at switching hardware, which is programmable. Now, I had for a long time essentially dismissed software-defined networking as a kind of marketing buzzword. Because after all the routers that I'd ever encountered, or the ones that we used to call gateways because we didn't know they were supposed to be called routers, were all software. I mean, they're programmed to do stuff. And so I thought, what's the big deal? Well, there is a big deal here because some of these platforms are very, very powerful switching engines, and all they know how to do is switch, but they don't do anything unless you explain to them what they're supposed to do. And so they are more programmable in a very fundamental way than a classic switch, which is using software almost exclusively to do the switching, whereas this is hardware that does the switching in accordance with a software program that tells it how it should evaluate the bits in the packet to decide where they're supposed to go, but it uses the hardware to do the actual forwarding. So I'm now persuaded that that is a paradigm shift in the implementation of switching systems for computer communications. And I'm now persuaded there's some very interesting horsepower to be applied there. So that's one technology. There's another one about which I know, again, not much, but the Magic Leap guys in Florida have written an article in Wired. I think if some of you may have already seen it. If you haven't, you might if you're curious about this, you might take the time to look. They've been able to produce images for us, by wearing, this glasses, not Google Glass in the classic sense, but something which is computer controlled, which puts relatively opaque images in front of you, embedded in the actual visual scene. So we're talking about not purely virtual reality, but augmented reality. where these virtual objects are injected into the field of view, and you can walk towards them and into them, and they're quite realistic. I don't know where that's all going to end up, but I'm persuaded that our ability to take the real world as it looks and then present information about it is a powerful and not yet well exploited idea. Imagine being able to stand on the top of a building looking out over the field of view and ask a question, what's that? And get back useful information. Or if you're navigating in a city you've never been to, the ability to get guidance in real time is pretty attractive. Now, I have to admit to you, though, that I've seen a lot of these things that you hang on your head for virtual reality that make you look like Darth Vader. And I remember thinking, I wonder how video conferencing is going to work. If everybody is wearing this thing, then what do you look like to the other people who are part of the conference? And of course, you don't want to look like Darth Vader. So suddenly there's a whole new business to be made where your virtual avatar that is presented in lieu of you because you're wearing this weird thing on your face. I'm not sure where that's going to go, but I can imagine me wanting to have more hair, for example. So there could be a whole new set of businesses. This stuff is reminiscent of what's also happening with the Internet of Things and automation in general. Everybody's worried that all these jobs will go away, the robots are coming. The robots are coming. There's no question about that. But I see them as partners and not as threats. It is true that some work that is classically done by people today will end up being done by machines and robots. Some of that work, by the way, will be done without physical involvement. Too many people misunderstand robot as only a thing which, can affect the real world by physically interacting with it. But a program trading system in the stock market is as much a robot as your favorite Boston Dynamics big dog. It should be obvious that those programs are taking input from the real world, the stock transactions, analyzing it, and taking actions which have a real-world effect on your bank account, for example, or on the economy. That's as much a robot as anything else, and we should be thinking along those lines. So I'm strongly persuaded that we will see robotic technology becoming increasingly useful to us, including the kinds of things that involve, for example, smart search, where more semantics are injected into the search process than has been the case in the past. So it used to be that we would just look for search terms and tell you here's all the pages that have those terms in them. Now we use something called a knowledge graph, which contains a great deal of semantic information, so that the terms that you use are run through the knowledge graph in order to get a better semantic depth before we actually do the search in the index of the World Wide Web, attempting to get a better semantic response for you. So those are all examples of tools that I am persuaded will become more and more commonplace. We do have an interesting problem, and that is, how do we take care of people whose jobs have been superannuated by automatic techniques or programmed methods? And the answer to that clearly is better education or more education, retraining, and things like that. Not to sound like this is too much of a nostrum, I would like to point out to you that the historical trend for humans is to live longer because of improved medical care, sanitation, diet, and everything else. That means that kids that are born today may very well easily live to 100 years old, which of course puts them into the 22nd century. My science fiction bulb over here is thinking, wow, that's amazing. Imagine being alive in the 22nd century. What's that going to be like? But what that does is force you to think a little bit about careers that might last 80 years. And you realize that over an 80-year period or a 70-year period, lots of technology changes will occur. I mean, all we have to do is look back 11 years and realize that we didn't have smartphones until 2007. So over that period of time, lots is going to happen. And it's unlikely that anyone's job is going to stay persistent over that period of time. We'll be forced to have to learn new things. So maybe we should just start out on the premise that we are going to be working and learning and working and learning and working and learning for our entire careers, and start out not by trying to jam everything that you possibly could need to know for a 50-year career in a 20-year period, but instead make it normal to keep learning new things, teaching kids how to want to learn, how to learn, and how to feel comfortable with the idea that they will go to work, go to school, go to work, go to school is a normal part of their lives. That's just that 4-year colleges and jamming everything into 4 years may not be the right model. You've seen college expenses going up dramatically. Maybe we need to rethink how we do this, how we distribute learning over a lifetime. And that suggests to me that our society will look pretty different in a few years' time as a result of that.
It's a great segue into talking about the people-centered internet, which I know is something that you've co-founded and started putting a lot of time into. Could you tell us about that?
So one of my colleagues, not at Google, but elsewhere, Mei-Lin Feng, who used to be at Oracle and is one of the founders of customer relationship management, and I got together and started this small little thing called People-Centered Internet. And the focus of attention, frankly, is on making the internet useful for people. And I confess to you that, oh yes, I don't know, is that a signal that I should stop? Or
I think there's a hook ready to go if we have to get off stage.
My job at Google as the chief internet evangelist is often to deal with policy questions, some of which are how to get more internet out there, how to create an environment where investment is welcomed, how to get governments to encourage competition and investment. But Mei-Lin's point, which I took very seriously, is that it's not enough just to get the internet out there. The question is, what can you do with it that is materially beneficial, that improves people's lives in a way that you could really point to in a quantitative way and a qualitative way? So our focus of attention is how to improve the use of internet for the benefit of the population that has access to it, whether that's better knowledge for healthcare, learning for a job change, or a variety of other kinds of uses. And so our focus is to try to make sure that as we are pushing hard to get more internet out there, which we need to do because only half the world's population has got access to it, we're also thinking hard about local content in local languages. I mean, nobody would find it very useful living in Quito looking for a plumber and getting the answer, there's a plumber in New York City. I mean, you need to get an answer that's locally useful. So we care a great deal about that. To be honest, this same effort, this people-centered internet, is edging into another category which you may already have questions about. It has to do with the emergence of fake news, of botnets and echo chambers and all these other things, which are very troubling and which we are going to have to deal with because we can't allow society to disintegrate simply because of the arrival of some of these effects. You may have questions about that, so I won't go any further on that, but I am prepared to talk at more length on that topic if necessary.
Just doing my job for me.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I'd like to hear more about what do you think are the current set of challenges and the barriers to actually continuing to grow the open internet.
So it's funny, some people ask me, Chief Internet Evangelist, why do you need to evangelize the internet? Isn't it obvious, that everybody should have access to it? And of course the answer is, even if it were obvious, it's not always true that in every place in the world where internet isn't, there is an appreciation and understanding of the value of implementing it. And of course, with the negative things that are showing up in the news now, there's even a pushback saying maybe this isn't the right thing to do at all. This is an example of a kind of emergent property that it's common for engineers to miss, and this is a apologia, right? I miss this. So this is my way of trying to escape too much culpability. I thought it was very important to push the barrier to access to this capability, this computer-mediated communication, to nearly zero, so that everybody could afford to get into the system, could afford to get access to information and services, could share knowledge in the system, to try to just get those barriers down to zero. What I didn't appreciate at the time is that in so doing, all of the bad elements of our society benefited from this same reduction in barrier. And so before we had internet and the World Wide Web, your ability to reach a large audience depended on your ownership of a television station, a radio station, a newspaper publishing empire, or magazines or something. Access to mass media was not available to everyone. Internet makes it possible for people to make use of this enormous distribution engine, virtually anybody with a smartphone. And the side effect of that, of course, is that there are people out there who deliberately want to pollute the information environment for their own purposes, who want to build botnets and use them to pollute the system, to launch denial of service attacks, to create false reinforcement of false information, to reinforce or maybe exacerbate and disturb isolated groups of people who, who think alike about certain things and are resistant to any other ideas. These echo chamber effects simply amplify that and reinforce, this is called confirmation bias in some circles. So we now have a problem because everybody, including these bad elements, have access to this system with which they can amplify their information. In a very funny way, this creates a big asymmetry. What used to be available only to a nation state is suddenly available to small groups of people, even individuals. So the question is, what do we do about that? In other infrastructure where we have discovered that there is abuse, we typically end up saying, well, the following things are unacceptable in our society. Now, sometimes, if we're lucky, we can actually take technical measures to inhibit some of the bad side effects. So, for example, seatbelts in cars. We tried a big persuasive campaign showing teenagers who were about to get their licenses, this is what you look like if you drive badly, get drunk, and kill yourself or your friends. And so this is why it's important to learn how to drive safely, how not to drink and drive, and so on. As much as we would teach that, we also put laws in place that said, by the way, if we catch you driving without your seatbelt, there will be consequences. So we have these technical means, we have these post hoc enforcement. And in the internet case, we're starting to see more of the post hoc stuff, which is we track people down who have done a bad thing. It's hard to figure out how to do this in an international setting because we're crossing boundaries that the legal regimes don't cross. And so this internet, which knows nothing about international boundaries at all, creates hazards that we didn't normally experience. So somebody in one country can attack somebody in another country. And unless there are agreements between those two countries, it may be very difficult, even if we know who the perpetrator is, to actually go after them and exercise those consequences. So those are two of the mechanisms that you can see evolving. You can see an interest in treaty arrangements. There is one called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, or MLAT, which turns out to be incredibly slow and clumsy. It may take weeks to months in order to get access to information that you need to track down a perpetrator, whereas these things happen in the internet in milliseconds. So there's a lot of attention being paid now to how to improve our ability to do cross-border law enforcement. There is a third thing that you can do, and that's moral suasion. Don't do that. It's just bad. It's wrong. And what's interesting, of course, is that sounds very weak. But I would draw your attention to one of the important forces of nature, gravity. It's the weakest force in the universe. And yet, when you have large mass, gravity is pretty powerful. It's what keeps us from flying off the planet, for example. So you can imagine a social analogy where there is a common and broad agreement on the following things not being acceptable socially. We may actually get a certain amount of social pressure to inhibit those bad behaviors. But like every other infrastructure we've ever designed and built, internet can be abused. It's like people that get drunk and drive their cars. We can't stop them, but we can tell them, if we catch you, there will be consequences. So that's the sort of thing which I think we are now faced with, is how to use this tool to its best advantage and how to respond when people abuse the tool. In a very funny way, this reinforces my enjoyment of Shakespeare, because, you know, Shakespeare wrote his plays 400 years ago, and yet they're still popular today because they're still relevant. All the bad things there are about human beings are reflected in those plays, and they're still relevant to the situation we find ourselves in today.
So we actually sourced some questions from the Reddit community, and some of them are actually really pertinent to this topic. One actually that comes up here is Dr. Hunda on Our Technology asks, okay, so net neutrality. What needs to be done to preserve our free flow of information, but also to enable businesses to flourish with it?
So this is question number 105. It comes up a lot. Number 101 is, did you have any idea that this was going to get this big? Yeah. So I won't pull the graduate student trick on you by answering question 101 instead of 105. And most graduate students, when asked the question, will try to distort the question around to the point where they can answer it. I hope I haven't insulted any graduate students here.
I was once a grad student.
So the answer, yeah, on the net neutrality side, I hope a lot of you recognize how we ended up here. I'll try to make this not too long. There is a fairly long chain here. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, there were 8,000 internet service providers in the US because internet was a dial-up service. And so you just had to rent a bunch of modem banks in order to be an internet service provider. And if you, as the consumer, didn't like the service, you could go to somebody else by dialing a different number. And so the switching back and forth between the service providers was very easy, and therefore it's a highly competitive thing. When broadband technology came along, cable modems, optical fiber modems, and DSL, for example, the number of providers telescoped down to very few. For any individual, there was a choice of 0, 1, or 2, really. Telco or cable co, or if you were in the rural parts of the country, nobody was offering you broadband service at all. So we didn't have a highly competitive market. And as these companies began to verticalize, as they began to not only offer their original things like telephone calls, and in the case of cable companies, video, as they started to also offer internet service, broadband internet service, you start to run into a potential hazard. Let's take a cable company that was offering video services plus high-speed internet, noticing that his customer is using the high-speed internet service to look at somebody else's videos. And so, you know, the temptation is potential temptation there to go mess up the internet service enough so that the competitor's videos won't work and it'll force your customer to only subscribe to your service. I'm not suggesting that anybody would actually do that, although there were there were some cases along these lines. Or blocking, for that matter, like voice over IP was blocked by some telephone companies, even though they were also offering internet service. So at some point, the cable companies and the telcos complained to the FCC that they were each offering internet service, but they were regulated by different regimes, because in the Telecom Act, there's a cable telecom regulation in Title VI, and there's a a telecommunications regulation for roughly telephony speaking in Title II. So they were whining to the FCC that they had different regulatory regimes even though they were both offering internet service. And so the FCC decided, well, let's fix that by not regulating internet. So they moved it to what's called Title I, which is an unregulated information service that did not pay any attention to the fact that the internet is, in fact, a layered structure, and there is a telecommunications component to it. But then at the same time, this same FCC said, well, but let's institute some rules. We'll call them the net neutrality rules. Don't block, don't interfere with other people's traffic, don't stop your customer from going to any legitimate place on the net. So the subsequent FCC, when it encountered abuses, tried to enforce the net neutrality rules and said, you can't do that, either we will fine you or cease and desist. And one of the abusers basically said, you don't have any grounds for fining or otherwise interfering because you said this is an unregulated service. You have no regulatory authority. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yep, the provider, internet service provider, was correct because the FCC had essentially said, this is not regulated, you have no authority. So the subsequent FCC said, well, that sucks. So they, well, I'm sure they said it in a little more delicate way, but then they voted to move this back to Title II, to move the internet service to Title II and say it is a regulated service, but we will forbear from regulating or from applying all the regulations of Title II, which include all the price controls and all kinds of other things in the historical telephony world. The more recent FCC decided they didn't like that very much, and so they voted on party lines to rescind the decision that the internet is a regulated Title II service. So it's now back to being an unregulated service. The side effect of that is that we are no longer protected by any ability of the FCC to respond to various kinds of potential harms to consumers. Now, to be accurate about it, the theory is that the Federal Trade Commission can now engage, but the way the Federal Trade Commission engages is a case-by-case adjudication of what is thought to be an abuse of, or consumer harm. And I'm not persuaded that this gives much guidance to the internet service providers, so I confess to you that I would prefer to see an FCC component to it. I would split this into two parts. One of them is making sure that the basic infrastructure and access to the internet is neutral in the sense that it doesn't interfere with consumer choice, it doesn't interfere with the quality of the service, doesn't permit kinds of special favors to somebody who pays you to do a better job for them. At the same time, if there are consumer abuses that have to do with content or fraud or other kinds of consumer harm, that's perfectly reasonable to show up as an FTC proceeding. So I would split this into two parts. With regard to the FCC part, I would not leave it in Title II. I think a separate title is appropriate for internet regulation, a very lightweight regulation. The problem is that in order to achieve such an objective, we would need the Congress to pass a law. And at the moment, it tends to pass gas, but not much law. So until we have a Congress that's capable of actually doing something, the likelihood that we will have a suitable regulatory framework for internet is remote. So that's where we stand.
On the lighter side, Dante asks, what is the best thing you've seen come from the internet? Alternatively, what's the worst? I will add the addition, they don't have to be different.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Well, in some sense, just in honest response to your last observation, the thing which is wonderful about the internet is its openness. The thing which is terrible about the internet is its openness. Another formulation of that is the wonderful thing about the internet is everything is connected. The worst thing about the internet is everything is connected. This is particularly visible as you start thinking about the Internet of Things, all these devices that we're surrounded with. I used to joke that the headline I was fearful of is 100,000 refrigerators attack Bank of America. I no longer tell that because, as you all know, 500,000 webcams attacked the Dine Corporation, so it's not funny at all. So we talked a little bit about the side effect of the freedom that has been given to all of us to both inject information into the net and to find information back. And it is, in fact, a yin and yang kind of thing that we now have to learn how to cope with. I still think, on balance, that the reduced barriers to the sharing of knowledge is a gift to our society, and that in a way we have to learn how to use that gift more effectively and to deal with the potential side effects. I would not want to go back to a world that has no internet in it, and I hope that's true for everybody else in this audience. So those are the immediate thoughts that come to mind. The other thing which I love about the internet is its architecture has invited new ideas to be injected into the system. If you didn't like the set of services that were available and you thought new protocols were needed, you were always free, and you are still free, to invent new protocols, and they can be lodged into the architecture wherever they're needed or desired. Even at the IP layer, which is really hard to change, there has been a significant injection of change, and that's with IP version 6. We're still pushing on that wet noodle. It's taken since 1996 to get to where we are now, which is about 30% penetration. I am fairly convinced that between mobile phones, smartphones, and Internet of Things, that everyone will recognize it's important to move to IPv6 so that we'll have enough address space to do all the things that we hope to do. I have to admit to you that there was a time once when I said that IPv6, which has 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, should be enough so every electron in the universe can have its own web page. And I got an email from somebody at Caltech shortly after that saying, "Dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there are 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe, and you're off by 50 orders of magnitude." So I don't tell that story anymore. Well, thank you all very much.